please. Now joining us for our second hour are Brenda Kosman, who's the director of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity and professor of law at the University of Toronto. Kimberly Manning, principal at Simone de Beauvoir Institute and associate professor in political science at Concordia University. And Melissa Potvin, a parent advocate and community leader. Thank you all for joining us. I believe, Ms. Manning, you were going to lead off, and we'll move to Ms. Potvin and finally Ms. Kosman. Ms. Manning, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Je suis très heureuse d'être.
I'm very pleased to be here with you today to speak about the reality of young trans people.
The eldest of whom is transgender. I am speaking to you today as a parent, a scholar, and as an advocate. Florence was 4 years old when we realized that her gender expression was not a phase, as some people kept telling us, but rather something more central to her identity. Fortunately for us, we had the advantage of tremendous resources at our disposal. Good incomes that allowed us to move to an expensive neighborhood so that my daughter could get access to an alternative school setting. Academic skills and connections that could be mobilized to generate new research and forms of support. A strongly supportive faith community, Montreal's Christ Church Cathedral, and the privilege of whiteness. Indeed, although we experience some very real challenges, these challenges cannot compare to those struggling at the margins of poverty and or those facing the combined oppressions of transphobia and racism. Florence is just one of hundreds of Canadian children who are now living openly in accordance with their felt sense of gender. Unlike Florence, however, many transgender young people have grave difficulty accessing food, education, healthcare, and shelter. Prior to coming to terms with Florence's gender nonconformity, I had never before considered the possibility that a child could be transgender. And this is despite the fact that I taught gender and politics at the graduate level at Concordia University. I thus understand why for some the idea of transgender and gender nonconforming children may seem perplexing. Transgender children are children whose gender identity does not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Although many transgender children know themselves to be a girl or boy, some are more fluid in their presentation and understanding of self. Research involving genetics, neuroanatomy, and studies of intersex diversity provide solid evidence that the biological basis of gender identity is strong. It is part of our very personal, profound, and intimate knowledge of ourselves. What we know now is that poor parenting is not a determining factor of transgender identities. Overall, research suggests that parenting connectedness is key for the well-being of trans youth. Findings the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Psychological Association have now incorporated into their guidelines for practitioners. The Senate, I would like to argue before you today, should pass Bill 16, C-16, unamended for three major reasons: affirmation, access, and autonomy. As a parent, I want my child to be seen as who she fully is. I want her to have the dignity that should be afforded to all people who reside in Canada. While I recognize that passing Bill C-16 does not guarantee that my child will be respected, I do know that law has a powerful role to play in changing public consciousness. As senators, you have an opportunity to bend the arc of history. At this moment of rising anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, sexism, and transphobia, you can offer not just my kid, but all kids in Canada a chance to expand their understanding of and appreciation for the diversity of human experience. I want Canadian children, regardless of their gender identity, to have full and safe access to all public institutions and public space. Bill C-16, if passed as is, can help ensure that gender-diverse children and youth have affirming access to public space, including bathrooms, social services, and shelters. Not all trans children and youth have the support of their caregivers. In fact, the majority do not. Despite this, most shelters are unprepared for transgender youth and continue to discriminate against them. Trans youth, especially young trans women of color, are among the most discriminated against groups of people in the shelter system. Trans people continually experience transphobic violence and erasure in shelters and housing programs across this country. Like so many of the challenges faced by transgender people in Canada, access to safe and affirming shelter cannot be fixed by the passage of Bill C-16 alone. But passage of Bill C-16 is an important step in the effort to provide trans youth with much-needed support. Most importantly, the passage of Bill C-16 will signal to agencies, shelters, and caregivers that all children and youth have the right to be affirmed, protected, and cherished. 2 years ago, Florence and I traveled to Ottawa to participate in a protest against amendments that had been introduced by this committee to Bill C-279. When critics argue that Bill C-16 is being rammed through without due process, I want you to remember that 2 years in the life of a child is the equivalent to 10.
That will have to do. We're moving on to Ms. Potvin.
Please let Bill C-16 come to a vote. Thank you.
I've been asked to come forward and tell my family's story. You must first know that by doing so, I put myself and my family at great risk. Many others have struggled to find ways that they can safely speak up on this issue, and some have had to keep quiet. After last telling our story publicly, we were bombarded with a number of letters and emails stating that we were sick and should be shot and burned. The only way I can think of truly expressing the fear we felt when we realized that our child was transgender is to share parts of the Facebook post that I posted to family and friends to come out. It was posted in August of 2013. When Warner was 2 years old, we were lying in bed one night. We were reading a story, and Warner said to me, "Mommy, I think God made a mistake." I asked what he meant, and he said, "I'm really a little girl." Warner was able to verbalize what we were already noticing in his daily life, but had dismissed as a phase. Since then, it has progressed. Warner insists he is a little girl on the inside. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. He is 6, or he was 6 at the time. How could he possibly even know that? I tell you, I thought the exact same thing. But the Warner I see today, who sits behind me, is very obviously a little girl, on the inside and out. This is not a phase. It will not go away. Please keep in mind this is a child. Please continue to look at Warner with love. God made him this way, and he has certainly opened our minds up. Warner is already being made fun of and already feels a lot of anxiety with regards to this. He has told us that he will kill himself if we insisted on cutting his hair and forcing him to look like a boy for school. My heart breaks every time I try to think about all this. I have a very hard time openly discussing this, and even after this post, I'm not sure if I'll be able to. The big decision here was to share this and to open up, or to continue and try and downplay it and hide it. But Warner is no longer giving us that option. In the past, I have avoided posting pictures of Warner when he was dressed as a little girl. Out of fear, I will no longer hide my child. Elmer and I are struggling with this, and it is a very emotional issue. Take it for what this post is meant for, to help us all understand people like Warner and know that they have no choice. He will suffer tremendously because of this, and already has. Our society has come a long way, but not quite far enough for children like Warner. He is not sick, nor is he just confused. Warner is, in fact, a little girl, aside from his boy parts. Again, I ask that you remember that in Warner's future, many people in this world will reject him, make fun of him, hurt him, and fear him. As a result, no matter what I choose as a parent, he will suffer, as many people like him have and do. I have faith in the people in our lives and want and hope that even those with religious views about this kind of stuff understand that if I could change this, I would. The big guy upstairs has reasons for everything, and we are all equally deserving of love and respect. All 4 of my children were identified as male at birth by doctors. However, for one of my twins, it was much more complicated than a simple glance at his genitals. Warner has been exhibiting female mannerisms and preferences at as early as the age of 3. We tried to encourage her to accept her male identity. Our first thoughts were that it was just a phase. We had even considered that she may be homosexual. And we were hopeful if that was the case, we could push it off until she reached puberty. Over the next few years, she kept saying that she was actually a girl. We had numerous discussions with our doctor, and we began researching children with behavior and thoughts like hers. I had no idea that children could even be transgender until I came across it in a Google search. Having Catholic and conservative beliefs, we initially dismissed the notion that one of our children could possibly be transgender. We read everything we could to try and understand, and meanwhile, we allowed Warner to wear dresses and female clothing in private. The fear of social rejection and inevitable bullying kept us hiding this secret for 6 years from the closest family and friends. By the age of 6, we were seeing an increase in Warner's distress with being labeled as a boy. She was sad and very uncomfortable in her own skin. We were worried for her. We sought medical help and consulted our priest. I will be honest, at that point, I wanted nothing more than for someone to fix my son. I soon understood that no one could give me the son I thought I gave birth to, because Warner was never really my son at all. Through medical guidance, reading, research, and with love and faith, we were able to see that supporting Warner to be herself gave her the best chance of growing up healthy and happy. We agreed to let her do social transition. This was the hardest decision of my life, the results of which were evident immediately. This uncomfortable and sad little boy became this beautiful, happy, outgoing little girl almost overnight. We quickly became aware of all the negativity families like our face. Many families live in constant fear and in hiding and don't even fathom the idea of letting their children live freely and openly. We weighed our options, pack up and start over somewhere else, or come out and deal with the consequences. To this day, I have many family and friends that will not speak to me and do not see my children.
Please come to a conclusion.
I'll just skip ahead then. Warner has already been bullied to the extent that no individual shall have to endure. I can give you an example of the type of abuse trans people face.
No.
Warner has been assaulted.
I'm sorry. You were all given a 5-minute limit. You've gone it over. We
Okay.
want to have time for questions. Our final presenter, Ms. Kosman.
Good morning. Good morning, Senators, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. In my brief remarks today, I wanted to speak to the constitutionality of Bill C-16, specifically focusing on the question of freedom of expression and some of the concerns that have been raised around the implications for pronoun usage. I apologize, I'm covering much of the terrain that the Minister covered this morning. As the Minister outlined, Bill C-16 basically does three things. It adds gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code, to the hate speech provisions of the Criminal Code, and the hate crimes provisions of the Criminal Code. My submission today is that none of these reforms will result in a violation of freedom of expression as guaranteed by the Charter of Rights. Let's start with the easiest one first, sentencing for hate crimes in Section 7182A1 of the Criminal Code. This provision allows evidence that an offense motivated by bias, prejudice, or hatred can be taken into account in sentencing. Race, national and ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, and sexual orientation are already included. Now, evidence of hatred on the basis of gender identity and gender expression can also be taken into account. It's important to emphasize here that Section 718 does not create a new offense. It simply means that an existing offense in the Criminal Code, like murder or aggravated sexual assault, if it is motivated by hatred, can be given an increased sentence. There's absolutely no impact here on freedom of expression or gender pronouns by adding gender identity and gender expression. The hate speech laws. These are actually three laws. There is three provisions: advocating genocide, public incitement of hatred, and the willful promotion of hatred. Do these provisions mandate pronoun usage or criminalize pronoun misuse? Not even close. It is absolutely not advocating genocide. Public incitement of hatred, well, that has a very, very high threshold as imposed by the court. It requires that there be a likelihood of the breach of the peace that will result in violence and personal violence. The misuse of pronouns, again, doesn't come close. The willful promotion of hatred. Well, hate speech laws also have a very high threshold. As the Minister mentioned several times this morning, the Supreme Court of Canada has repeatedly defined hate speech as only including the most extreme forms of speech. And I quote, extreme manifestations of detestation or vilification, not dislike, disdain, or offense. Further, again, as the Minister mentioned, hate speech criminal charges cannot be laid without the approval of the Attorney General. Pronoun misusage, without more, simply could not give rise to a charge of hate speech, let alone a conviction. Now, also as the Minister stated, while talking about hate speech laws more generally, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently upheld the constitutionality of these laws, both criminally and within human rights codes. From Keegstraw in 1990 to a unanimous court in Watcott in 2011, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that any restriction that these laws place on freedom of expression is a reasonable limit within the meaning of Section 1. Finally, C-16 adds gender expression and gender identity to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Code, joining the 10 other provinces and territories that have already done so and the rest of the provinces and territories which have now introduced them. Now, what might this mean specifically in requiring pronoun usage? There are as yet no rulings on this. The only thing that we have right now is the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policy. And in the Ontario Human Rights Commission's opinion, and I quote, refusing to refer to a person by their self-identified name or proper personal pronoun could constitute gender-based harassment. But it's further clarified its position, noting that the Ontario Human Rights Commission does not require any particular gender-neutral pronoun. They suggest the use of the word they, or, if you are not comfortable with that, simply use a person's chosen name. Now, in this bill, C-16 has no specific requirement of using any particular pronouns. There is no particular requirement to use any particular gender-neutral pronoun. There is a requirement that people not be intentionally misgendered. It is not a right to a particular gender-neutral pronoun. And I believe that it does not even, in fact, mandate the use of gender-neutral pronouns. If people oppose that, they can simply abide by the law by using a person's name. It requires that we don't use the wrong name, and if you don't like the right one, then just use a person's name. Much has been made that this is compelled speech, and that for some reason this seems to be the first time that the law is telling us what we must say as opposed to what we cannot say. This is simply not true. There are many, many examples in Canadian law of compelled speech. 3, the bilingual labeling requirements on food packaging, the health warnings on cigarette packages, and the oath of allegiance to the Queen at citizenship ceremonies are 3 examples where the Supreme Court of Canada has upheld the constitutionality of each of these. Bill C-16 is not about the violation of freedom of expression. It's actually about another charter right. It's about Section 15 and the equality of trans and gender non-binary Canadians.
All right, thank you. We'll move to questions beginning with Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. I will be brief. Thank you to all 3 witnesses, and especially Ms. Potman and Ms. Manning. Your speeches were heartfelt, and certainly I don't think anybody in this room disagrees that bullying and hate speech should be illegal and already is. So I think we're all on the same page there. I'm trying to wrap my head around the concept of enshrining rights based on an individual's identity. So I think my question will be for Ms. Manning and or Ms. Potman. Do you believe that people can identify as another race, another age, as transabled? Do you believe that these individuals are as valid as those identifying another gender? I met with a biologically male adult who identifies as a 6-year-old girl. Do you believe this individual's feelings of being a female are more legitimate than his feelings as being a child? And lastly, do you believe that any of these groups should have special protection under the law?
You said for either.
Listen, Ms. Kosman, if you want to answer, that's fine.
So I don't think that we are here today to discuss a whole series of identities. I think that we are here today to discuss a bill that specifically protects gender identity and gender expression. I believe that Bill C-16 is a fundamentally important bill to address the unique vulnerabilities and disadvantages that trans and gender diverse Canadians have experienced historically and still today. And I don't think that the other examples that you are giving are ones that are in any way on the public policy table.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you, Senator Jaffer.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to all 3 of you for being here. When listening to both of you, Ms. Manning and Ms. Potwin, I'm very humbled. It takes a lot of courage because you brought very intimate things into the public. Unfortunately, we have great time limits, and so if you would provide your full speech to the clerk, we will certainly read it. Because of time limits, I can ask one question. And so, Ms. Crossman and Ms. Manning, my question to both of you is, as you have, I think, been in the room and we've had the issue of equal rights under 15 and freedom of expression. And when those 2 are in competition, how do we deal with that?
Well, the idea that there's a competition here in some way, shape, or form, to me, it just does not compute. What we're talking about here is a basic recognition of dignity and making sure that our law now is updated so that fundamental facets of human diversity are respected and protected within Canadian law. To me, nobody is losing out. And as was just made very, very clear by Professor Kosman, the chances of people somehow having their speech abrogated are 0 to none.
And I would simply add that there are situations where charter rights do come in conflict. And the Ontario Human Rights Commission has very elaborate policies on how to approach competing rights, and it is the job of the courts to actually address these questions. Sometimes charter rights do come in conflict. They did come in conflict in the Keekstraw case. They came in conflict in the Watcott case. And this is the work of the Supreme Court of Canada, who finds the way to balance those rights.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Pate.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for coming, and thank you both to Ms. Manning and Ms. Potvin for your support for your daughters and for the work that you've been doing on behalf of the entire community, and much appreciation. So my question, and following up, and Ms. Kosman also from a question that Senator Omidvar asked of the minister, is in light of that, in terms of the formal recognition of the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of gender identity and expression, have you done any research, or are you familiar with any research that might be available on what the adverse impact, if any, might be on preventing discrimination on the grounds of sex?
There is very little research that's actually been done on this yet. There is one case, the Nixon case, decided quite a few years ago, that put the question of gender and gender identity into some degree of conflict. And again, that was a question where the courts had to figure out how to resolve this question. But it seems to me that this is a place where giving rights to one group is not actually taking away the rights from any other group. This is a place where extending rights to one group is simply about extending rights to that group. I don't see this. I do think that there are ways where equality rights and freedom of expression rights do occasionally come into conflict. I don't see that gender identity and gender expression actually coming into conflict with sex.
Thank you.
Can I just add on to that too? Because I know that there have been some questions being raised in this body about whether, and I'm going to put it right here on the table, whether women's rights are going to be undermined by this legislation. And I'd like to speak to that directly by saying, as I'm currently the director of one of the oldest women's studies programs in the country, I'm a very strong feminist. I was in Beijing in 1995, so I've been around a long time in feminist circles and work. And I have to say that passing Bill C-16 is one of the most feminist pieces of legislation that we can pass at this moment in time. As far as I am concerned, supporting and affirming the rights of trans people, particularly transgender women, right, who are targets for misogenic kind of attacks, is really, really critical at this moment in history. So I should also say transgender women of color, especially. So I would just like to note that as a very, very long-term feminist, I mean, my father can correct me on this, but I think I was probably 9 years old when I first identified as a feminist. For me, this is the most pro-feminist thing that we can do at this moment in history. Yeah.
Senator Ahmedabad.
Thank you. I won't take up too much time in thanking you all for sharing your life story. It is certainly moving. I have a question of either Professor Kosman or Ms. Manning. What percentage of the Canadian population is transgendered? Has this number changed significantly over time? And do you project that this number will change with the passing of this law, and if so, why?
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. So we don't have good statistics yet, and I think hopefully in the next few years, with changes with the long-form census, we're going to have much better data within the next few years. But I can tell you, with data out of New Zealand, with respect to transgender youth in particular, right now about 1.6% of trans youth are out in New Zealand, sort of as young people, as teenagers. What we're seeing already before the passage of this bill are huge increases of young people coming to clinics across the country. And when I say huge increases, I mean increases by 400 and 500% between 2009 and 2015. Okay? So the number of young people who are going to be affected, whose lives are going to be improved by the passage of this bill, we cannot underestimate that number. It's hard to put any tabulation on at this point, but I can tell you that these young people are coming out in increasing numbers, and they need us standing behind them.
Okay. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Chair. This might be a question impossible to answer briefly, but let me ask you if you would mind sharing your views on the need for which there is public education around the issue of gender identity and gender expression, so that the kind of things that your children have experienced personally as well as in their public environments might be alleviated.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this question. There is a tremendous need for public education at this point in time. And in fact, that's one of the major reasons that I'm here today, because I feel like with the passage of Bill C-16, we have an opportunity to present to all Canadians to understand much more deeply how necessary it is that we recognize the rights and well-being of transgender and gender diverse people in this country. The need is huge, and it's going to require a lot more than parents like ourselves and the many other parents we know who have been coming out and doing media work, because that's been the main form of communication that we've had available to us, to let other parents know that it's okay to affirm your child, to let other school boards know that it's okay and in fact it's necessary to create safe spaces for all of the children in their schools. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, this is only the first step. But in fact, there is so much more work to do, and particularly for those who are not just fighting transphobia, but are also marginalized by poverty and racism and so many other forms of oppression as well.
All right. Thank you. Senator Joel.
Chair, Ms. Gossman, I'm trying to catch the legal equivalence between gender identity or gender expression. In other words, if there is a complaint based on one or the other, what would be the distinctive elements for you to choose to go under one rather than the other? Or would you go at both at the same time, even though the bill says or? So the bill distinguishes between the two. Could you explain to us, on the basis of the legal definition, how that should be approached in terms of its common understanding?
I think that is a very, very good question that there isn't going to be an answer for just yet. Like the other listed grounds of prohibitions on discrimination, it is up to individual litigants who bring their complaints forward to decide which criteria they want to make their complaint on the basis of. So it will be up to individuals themselves to identify, is this gender identity or gender expression? I imagine in the short term what we are going to see is that those complaints will be brought on both bases. And it will then be for the tribunals and eventually the courts who will begin to articulate the definitions of both. So the fact that there is no definition in Bill C-16 itself does not mean that definitions will not evolve. They will evolve with the tribunals and with the courts and eventually with the Supreme Court of Canada. I think that the way in which the distinction between gender identity and gender expression evolves will then in turn lead people to make choices based on, well, it actually seems more like this one or more like that one. But it is something that is going to evolve initially based on litigant choice and then eventually based on tribunals and courts.
So in other words, the arguments of Egal that we've heard could be addressed by the fact that the complaint would be based on both at the same time. In other words, the court would not have to say on gender identity you win, but you fail on gender expression. The court would address it more or less as a whole, legally. Do you think I'm right or wrong in that approach of how the court will wrestle with that?
I've learned to try not to predict what the courts are going to do because it's proven me. I think that it may evolve as one concept. I think it's equally likely that it will evolve as two distinct concepts. And again, that will be up for the courts to struggle with and articulate along the way. I also think that the question about is gender expression too vague and might it be struck down because it's constitutionally too vague, we can't decide whether it's too vague until the courts have had an opportunity to actually define those terms, much like it is over time evolved definitions for all the other terms of prohibited discrimination.
May I have another question? Ms. Manning, you know, and I hesitate to mention that to you, but you know, the old cultural phenomenon of impersonation, which is part of the entertainment industry, to a point, trivialize transgender problem. Because it is seen as if, you know, you decide to one day to be a man, another time to be a woman, and then you just put those clothes in the closet, and then you are who you are. It seems to me that there is a real cultural issue with how traditionally we have approached, you know, that I should say the cultural phenomenon of impersonation. I know I'm outside the bill, Mr. Chair, but it's part of the education, you know, issue that has been raised by Senator Sinclair in a way.
I'm not
very quickly. I know the chair might
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I think in fact that, you know, what we're talking about is a Western understanding of gender and gender expression. And in fact, there are many cultures around the world who have very, very different understandings of what gender can look like and how it's expressed. And the idea that somebody might feel one gender in one capacity and another gender in another capacity, there are lots of different contexts in which that is not just accepted, but it's valued, and often as part of deep spiritual traditions. Now, I think what you're speaking to is an idea that has been presented in film and TV alongside many other kinds of, I would say, deeply mischaracterizing and often very transphobic representations of transgender people and the struggles that they face. And we have to remember also, and I think this is really key, that for many people until very recently and up until today, to actually live fully in accordance with your true self when you're a transgender person has been all but impossible, given the social ridicule and stigma that's associated with that. And so this whole idea of impersonation, I think, to me is, yeah.
Okay, Senator Boniface.
First of all, thank you all for being here, and particularly want to thank Ms. Manning and Ms. Potman for your comments, because I think there's nothing more emotional than your own children. And so I deeply appreciate you speaking on this issue. I'm interested in if there is any stats collected around acts of violence, the bullying, are the schools capturing this? Because I think that that is a really important information to be on the table.
Yeah. Do you want to address that? Do you have this? Yeah, I do. Yes, so absolutely. And what we know, I mean, there have been a number of surveys now. The largest was a 2015 study that came out of UBC. I've quoted it and cited it in my brief, where the violence and the threats of violence that transgender young people experience in schools in particular is astronomically high. Well over, I think, 60%, and for some it's a daily occurrence, right? So we're not talking something, that occasionally, somebody gets asked a rough question. No, we're talking, for many people, this is a daily lived experience, and therefore it is no wonder that many trans young people are facing such high rates of health issues, of suicide, and, as I was discussing earlier, of homelessness as well. So first it's parent acceptance and support, but then the second place are the schools. And the schools, I'm sorry, but are failing us miserably at this point in time.
Can I just say something?
Please.
My daughter, when she came out, it was a very difficult thing to conquer. We live in rural Ottawa in a Catholic community, and our school is Catholic as well. Within months of coming out and living as her true self, she was attacked by a group of other children that were double her age, 6 or 7 of them, who actually pinned her down to the ground, trying to figure out what her gender was by removing her clothing and trying to see what her genitalia were. This is not rare. This is a common occurrence for these children. It's not an exceptional case. This happens every day. I could give you hundreds of examples I've heard firsthand, seen firsthand, or been involved with for these kids. And the schools aren't equipped to deal with it because there are no policies or laws in place. They don't know what to do. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to each of you. Very, very compelling and powerful, emotional in many respects presentations. There is an interesting irony that some of the people who oppose this bill do so on the basis of of the claim that it might be an affront to their freedom of speech, a form of expression, and yet in imposing this bill, they're denying the protection of another form of expression, gender expression. But my specific question really is to get at what, the day after this bill is passed, will this mean to parents like you, Melissa Potvin and Kimberly Manning, and to your children and to your family? How will this change your lives for the better? Florence and Warner.
Well, we live every day in fear for our daughter, for her future. We are terrified of what she faces, the discrimination, the harassment, the judgment. Having this bill in place, we know will not solve every problem, but at least sends a message to Canadians that it is unacceptable to discriminate against individuals based on their gender identity and gender expression. And for us, I mean, this is absolutely key to our children's future. We're fighting for our children's lives. It's not just some bill to us. For us, it's our children's lives and their future.
Thank you. Can I be in the second round?
Yes.
Oh,
go ahead.
The other question is perhaps a more technical, but it also will impact people at a human level, and that is that there's a strange inconsistency, it seems to me, in the question of defining trans or gender identity and gender expression in this bill. And that inconsistency is that no other element that's listed in the bill of that nature is defined. Is it not another strange irony, and would it not be a hurtful one, that in a bill that's designed to prevent discrimination, it would be inherently discriminatory to single out these two items, gender identity and gender expression, by defining them in a way that clearly isn't necessary because the courts and tribunals have been doing that and will continue to do it? Would that be hurtful, in fact?
I think that it absolutely would. And I think it's worth observing that historically, when new grounds of discrimination have been added to either the criminal code or to human rights codes, similar arguments have been raised in opposition. So most recently, when sexual orientation was added, there were all kinds of arguments ad absurdum, about what kinds of orientations might this include, and will this then allow the legal recognition of pedophilia as a sexual orientation? These kinds of arguments ad absurdum, and saying, well, then you must absolutely define sexual orientation. We didn't. We didn't define sexual orientation because there was a clear understanding that it was intended to protect the rights of gay and lesbian Canadians. Here, it is very clear that the intention is to protect the rights of trans and gender diverse Canadians. And the idea that we need to single this out, I think, is completely wrong. We don't define any other ground of discrimination, either in the Charter, in the Human Rights Codes, or in the Criminal Code. And it would be wrong to start here.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that, if I may? Thank you. So I would just like to say further to the last two questions, with respect to protections and vulnerable populations. The last time this came through this committee, the committee slapped on an exemption for federal protected spaces. And I have to say, I would like to ask that you all remember, when you're considering moving forward with this bill, that 40% of transgender young people feel unsafe in their school washrooms today. So when you're thinking about protecting vulnerable children and youth, I want you to think about transgender kids and what they are suffering, not in some kind of hypothetical state down the line, but right now, at this very moment that I'm speaking.
Okay, we have time for a brief second round, beginning with Senator Plett.
Chair, I'm hoping that Ms. Kosman will believe that this is part of this bill and will answer this question. Presently, the only protected ground that is not an immutable characteristic and is based on an internal and personal experience is religion. There is protection for discrimination based on religion, but the expression of that religion is implicitly covered by this ground. Likewise, do you not agree that gender expression would be covered by gender identity?
So I actually can't honestly answer the question. I think that if the bill only protected gender identity, it would then be up to the courts to decide how broadly to define that and whether that should also include gender expression. If the bill, as it does here, has both gender identity and gender expression, then again it will be up for the courts to elaborate, to define and distinguish between these two concepts. Now, across the country, if you look at the provincial human rights codes, some of them protect only gender identity, some of them protect gender identity and gender expression. And so it will actually take some time for the tribunals and for the courts to actually articulate the relationship between the two, whether gender identity is the overarching concept, which includes gender expression, or whether they actually are two quite distinct forms of protection.
The Ontario definition of gender identity, as well as Bill C-279, states that, and I quote, sex is assigned at birth. Do you believe sex is assigned at birth? Ms. Potman talked about her son having come to her at 6, I believe, and said, I think God made a mistake. So do you believe, Ms. Kosman or any of the others, that sex is assigned at birth?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, the Ontario definition of gender identity says sex is assigned at birth. We have heard the sponsor of this bill in his speeches a number of times say the sex assigned at birth. Now, I didn't take science beyond high school, but my understanding of biological sex that was determined by anatomy and chromosomes, and it wasn't assigned at birth. So people are saying I was assigned the wrong sex at birth.
I can speak to that, thank you. So what we're talking about is when a doctor or midwife looks at a child's genitals and says, oh, I see a penis, or oh, I see a vulva. And on the basis of that, they make a decision of what they think the sex of the child is. Now, in this bill, what we're enshrining into law is the protection of gender identity and gender expression. You just spoke of chromosomal, genetic, there are all kinds of different basis for one's constitution as a sex, as a biological experience. But that is not necessarily the same as one's gender identity. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about when a physician or a midwife looks at a child's genitals and says, oh, that's what we have here. And then what we find out later is sometimes that's not actually the case.
But they didn't assign the sex, but thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair. One can't help but be absolutely horrified by the story you told. And I want to share my disgust and dismay that this happens in Canadian schools in particular. I want to understand the material impact of C-16 on that particular kind of context, because this is federal law, schools are provincial. I want to understand how this will play out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Yes, very pleased that so many of the provinces have been moving ahead of this House to ensure that, or try to make sure that schools are beginning to comply and create safe spaces for all children and young people. However, and what I really want to stress here today is that the passage of this law, even though it does not technically affect ministries of education, it, in a sense, sends a clear signal to all Canadians and all jurisdictions that it is absolutely unacceptable to discriminate against transgender and gender diverse Canadians and all transgender and gender diverse peoples living in Canada. So I just want to be very, very clear that this body has an incredible responsibility to send a message to everybody else who is in Canada today about the importance of the passage and the protection of these rights. And I think that's going to be the biggest impact of this work moving forward. Yeah, thank you.
There will be a ripple effect, I think.
Okay.
Once this bill is passed, it will eventually, it'll give them the kick in the pants they need on other levels to recognize the need for protection for these children and adults. Yeah, sorry.
Kick in the pants.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Senator Jael.
Mr. Chair, let's try to put this in a international perspective. Could you inform us, Ms. Kosman, or maybe Mrs. Manning, because you're in that kind of studies, which other country would have similar provision in their statute than what Bill C-16 seeks to achieve? And I was thinking, of course, of the usual suspect, which is United States and UK, but there might be other countries in the European Union that might have similar protection, or any other country in the Western world, because my preoccupation is at the moment that becomes part of the Canadian law. The Canadian government has a responsibility in the international forum to promote those rights. So to me, it's very important. We know with who we are playing the world stage.
Actually, thank you. I think this is a terrific question, and I will leave it to Professor Kosman to speak specifically to other countries. But right now, we are at a moment in history where we're seeing south of the border legislation being introduced, and in some cases passed, which is transphobic in the extreme. And we're seeing this with the bathroom bills that are being introduced right now. So I would argue that right now, in history, Canada has an important responsibility to signal that we are not going to go down that road, and that we are, in effect, going to show what it means to protect all of the people who reside within our borders. So I think that we can play a real leadership role on this file internationally.
Can I just say something first? Please. I can speak to experience with this. Most recently, we were approached by the BBC network, and what they are saying is the UK is looking to Canada to see what we are doing. Because we have seen such an influx and we have started the health care for children like this, they are actually looking to us to be the example. We recently took part in a documentary to express this, and the idea was to show UK what we're doing. So we have a chance to be real leaders on the international level right now.
So the United States is not the place to look to right now for the protection of most things. There are a host of countries that have different kinds of protections for trans individuals. Some places where one might not expect them. There was a recent decision of the Indian Supreme Court that actually extended protections to trans citizens. New Zealand has some very interesting developments afoot. The Israeli Supreme Court has made a decision. Actually, it's not the Supreme Court; it's one of the lower courts on trans rights. So this is a thing that is emerging in a kind of patchwork around the world right now, much the way that same-sex marriage evolved in a patchwork, where Canada was among the frontrunners, where Canada was a global leader. We're not alone in doing this, but it remains a bit of a patchwork, and we certainly can provide leadership, but we aren't alone.
So in other words, then, our usual, I should say, countries of comparison like the European Union, are they, besides UK that Mr. Poitvin has mentioned, are they other European countries, you know, of the European Union who have similar protection, you know?
I'm not up to date with the
I've not looked.
European
I should
Union
have
at the moment.
looked, you know,
I could.
I'm lazy. I
yeah.
should have looked myself. But since you come as an expert on this, that's why I find it easy to.
I'd actually have to look to see the various decisions that are emerging from the European Union and from the Human Rights Court.
All right. Thank you.
Of course, everyone is busy withdrawing from the European Union at the moment.
And the sub-question, is United Nations having any kind of group study in relation to transgender people?
I'm sorry, I missed
I said
the United Nations?
Yeah. Does United Nations have any group study on the rights of transgender people?
They are included, so there's now a special ambassador for LGBT rights that has only been in existence for a couple of years. It's still a very new position. The current commissioner is from Thailand, I believe, and they are starting to do some of this work, but they also have a lot of catch-up work to do, even in terms of the gay and lesbian piece, and unfortunately the trans piece often follows behind.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Final question, Senator Mitchell.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Dr. Manning, when we were discussing this over the weeks and months, you'd mentioned that a very interesting juxtaposition, that the specific impacts of this bill on the lived, often desperately lived experience of trans people against the arguments opposing that are often extremely hypothetical, and those often fall into several categories, one of which is shelters, and another one of which is sports. And I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, we're at a moment where we are seeing the evolution of law, we're seeing the evolution of our society. And what we do know is the lived experiences that I have done my very best to document in my brief. And it's pretty horrifying. I think it makes for pretty horrifying reading material. This is real. This is happening right now, and it's happening across the country. The arguments that I've heard in opposition to Bill C-16, or wanting to propose amendments or changes, et cetera, are based, as far as I'm concerned, on hypotheticals and what-ifs. We have a very strong court system. We have a very strong and astute and well-researched bill that has been presented before you. To me, it's a no-brainer. And if I may, I would just like to close with the words of my daughter, Florence, who, when we were discussing our preparation for coming here today, said to me, "Look, Mom, it's just respectful that we pass this bill."
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, witnesses, for being here today and for your informative and I think in many respects very heartfelt testimony. Much appreciated. Meeting adjourned.